She was standing in my kitchen when I came home early from my doctor's appointment, and she had my son's laptop open on the counter, typing something fast. The moment she heard the door, she snapped it shut and turned around with a smile so wide it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you're back early," she said. "I am," I said. That was the moment I knew. I didn't have proof yet. I didn't have anything except the cold feeling that had been sitting in my chest for 8 months, the one I kept trying to talk myself out of. But standing there in my own kitchen, watching my daughter-in-law's smile freeze on her face, I finally stopped arguing with myself. Something was very wrong. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 63 years old, I spent 31 years working as a forensic accountant before I retired, and I know what it looks like when someone is hiding something in the numbers. I know what it looks like when the story doesn't add up. And my daughter-in-law's story had never quite added up. Her name is Melissa. She married my son, Daniel, 4 years ago, and for the first 2 years I told myself I was just being a protective mother. Daniel was 41, never married, the kind of man who threw himself into his work and forgot to eat dinner. He loved her. He was happy. I watched him become lighter, more open, and I thought, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she's exactly what he needs. Then his father died. My husband, Robert, passed away 18 months ago after a short illness. He was quick about everything, even dying. We had been married for 38 years. He left behind a house in Portland that we'd owned since 1987, a modest investment portfolio, and a life insurance policy. Not a fortune by any measure, but enough. Enough for me to live comfortably, enough to eventually pass on to Daniel when I was gone. The week after the funeral, Melissa started asking questions. They were small at first, casual, slipped into conversation the way you might ask about the weather. Did Robert have a will? Had I spoken to an estate attorney? Was the house in both our names or just his? I answered her because I was grieving and I wasn't thinking straight, and because I told myself she was just being practical. Some people handle grief by focusing on logistics. But then the questions kept coming. How was I feeling? Was the house too big for just me now? Had I thought about what I'd do long term? And Daniel, I noticed that Daniel started echoing her. Not in a pushy way, not at first. More like he'd been briefed beforehand. Mom, Melissa and I were thinking, maybe you should consider downsizing. Mom, have you updated your will since Dad passed? Mom, we just want to make sure you're protected. I was 62 years old and I had worked with financial documents for 3 decades. I knew what estate fraud looked like. I knew what undue influence looked like. And I knew that I was not yet ready to admit that my son might be part of it, willingly or not. So I watched. I started keeping a small notebook, the kind I used to carry when I was still working. Every conversation I thought was strange, I wrote it down. Date, time, what was said, who said it. I noted when Melissa would find reasons to be alone in rooms where I kept documents. I noted when Daniel started referring to the house as this house instead of your house. Small things, tiny things, the kind of things you'd feel foolish bringing up to anyone. My sister thought I was paranoid. My friend Carol, who has known me since college, listened to me over coffee one afternoon and said gently that grief does strange things to us, that I might be projecting. I nodded and said maybe she was right. I drove home and wrote everything down in my notebook. 6 months after Robert died, my son suggested we all sit down together, the 3 of us, to talk about what he called long-term planning. Melissa had printed out documents. Actual printed documents, sitting in a neat folder on my dining room table. She had consulted, she said, with a financial planner. She had some ideas about how to structure things for tax efficiency. She used the phrase for tax efficiency 4 times in 20 minutes. I had a sudden sharp image of myself 30 years ago, sitting across the table from clients who were about to be taken for everything they had, and the person doing it was always very calm and always used phrases like, for tax efficiency. I asked to keep the documents to review them. Melissa said, of course. Absolutely. Take all the time you need. I took them to my own attorney the next morning. His name is Gerald, and he has handled my family's legal matters for 20 years. He read through everything carefully, and then he looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, Helen, where did these come from? I told him. He was quiet for a moment. These documents, if signed, would restructure the ownership of your house into a joint trust that would give your son and his wife equal survivorship rights. Combined with what she's outlined here regarding your investment accounts, if anything happened to you, the distribution would be, he paused, heavily weighted toward her, not Daniel. I felt the floor move under me, just slightly. She's done this before, Gerald said. I stared at him. He turned his computer monitor toward me. He had already started looking while I sat there. Melissa's maiden name, her previous marriage, a man named Thomas in Tucson who had died 3 years before she married Daniel. Thomas had been 67. His children from a previous relationship had contested his estate. The case had been settled out of court. The details were sealed, but the outline was there, in public records, for anyone who knew how to look. I drove home, and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I was not angry yet. Anger came later. What I felt first was something colder and more focused, the same feeling I used to get when an audit started to crack open, and I could see the full shape of what someone had done. It was not satisfaction. It was more like clarity. Like suddenly the light was right and I could finally see every edge of the thing clearly. I called Gerald back that afternoon. I need to know everything that's legally possible, I said, and I need to know what kind of evidence I would need. He told me. I started that weekend. The first thing I did was call a locksmith and have new locks installed on my home office door. I told Daniel it was because I'd lost my spare key, which wasn't true, but it wasn't a lie I felt very bad about. Inside that office was every financial document I owned, the deed to the house, the investment account statements, Robert's life insurance paperwork, my own updated will, which I had quietly rewritten with Gerald 2 weeks earlier. Everything that mattered was now behind a door that only I could open. The second thing I did was buy a small digital recorder, not anything fancy, the kind a reporter might carry. I kept it in my cardigan pocket whenever Melissa came to visit. She visited often. That was one of the things I had written in my notebook. She visited more than Daniel did, and always seemed to find reasons to come alone. Errands she was running nearby, books she wanted to return. Once she came to drop off soup because she'd heard I had a cold, and she spent 40 minutes asking me detailed questions about whether I'd reviewed the documents yet, and whether I'd had any thoughts. I sat across from her at my kitchen table with the recorder running in my pocket, and I said I was still reviewing, and I smiled, and I offered her more tea. She took the tea and she told me, very gently, very warmly, that she just wanted to make sure I was taken care of, that Daniel worried about me living alone, that the house was a lot of responsibility for one person, that she and Daniel had talked about it, and if I ever wanted to think about moving in with them, or if I ever needed help managing things, they were right there. "You're like a mother to me," she said. I said, "That means so much." The recorder was running. There is a moment in every investigation, and I had been part of enough of them to know this, where you get the thing you actually need, not a piece of it. The whole thing, laid out clearly enough that no one can argue with it. You can't rush toward it. You have to wait for the person to hand it to you, because they always eventually do. People who are doing something wrong are almost always confident that they are being careful enough. That confidence is the gap you wait for. Mine came on a Tuesday. I had told Daniel and Melissa that I was flying to visit my sister in Minneapolis for a long weekend. I told them the dates. I booked the ticket. And then I called my sister and told her I was coming, but that I would be arriving a day later than I'd said. I drove to a hotel 6 miles from my house, and I checked in under a credit card. I kept separate, the one I used for work expenses back when I was still working. Old habit. I stayed one night, and the next morning I drove back home and parked 2 streets over and walked. My house has a side door that opens to the laundry room. The key for it is not on the ring I keep by the front door. It's in a small clay pot on the 3rd shelf of my garage, and I have never told anyone it exists. I used it to enter quietly. She was in my office. I don't know exactly how she got through the new lock. Later, Gerald told me she had likely hired someone because the lock showed signs of being picked. But she was in there, and she had my file cabinet open, and she was photographing documents with her phone. I stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. She didn't hear me. She was focused, methodical, working through the files one by one. I walked back out the side door, and I called Gerald from the driveway. "How soon can you be at my house?" I said. "An hour," he said. "Bring whoever you need to bring," I said. "And Gerald, call the non-emergency police line and tell them there's an ongoing unauthorized entry. I want an officer." While I waited, I sat in my car and I was very still. I thought about Daniel. I thought about his face when he told me he loved Melissa, the way he had looked younger when he said it. I thought about my husband and how Robert would have handled this, and I thought probably the same way I was handling it, because we had been alike in most of the ways that mattered. Gerald arrived with a police officer and his own paralegal 34 minutes later. I let them in through the front door, and then I walked them through my house to the office. She was still there. I will not pretend that watching her face change when she saw the officer was not one of the most complicated moments of my life, because it was. I am not a cruel person. I did not enjoy what happened to her expression, that first flash of complete shock, and then something scrambling behind her eyes, looking for any story that would work. She started to say something. She said my name, and then she said she could explain, and the officer told her calmly to please not say anything until she understood her rights. There is a kind of silence that comes after something like that, where everyone in the room is very careful with their breathing. Gerald's paralegal had a document bag. She started photographing the file cabinet, the position of the files, the phone Melissa had been using. I stood in the doorway of my own office, and I thought about the notebook I had started keeping the week after Robert's funeral, and all the small things I had written down, because I knew in my body they mattered even when I couldn't explain why. And I thought that in all the years I had worked as a forensic accountant, the most important skill I ever learned was this: when the numbers tell you something is wrong, you do not talk yourself out of it. You follow it to the end. The officer had a quiet conversation with Gerald. I found out later that he had confirmed with Gerald that the documents Melissa had been photographing included a copy of my will, my investment account statements, and this was the part that made my chest tight, a copy of a new power of attorney that I had not filed yet and had not signed. She had been photographing a draft that only Gerald and I knew existed. She had not been scouting. She had been working from inside information. Someone had told her what to look for. I did not want to think about what that meant regarding my son. Gerald's firm spent the next 2 weeks piecing it together. The financial planner Melissa had hired, the one who had prepared those original documents she'd brought to my dining room, had been the same firm that handled Thomas's estate in Tucson. The same name appeared on 3 documents across 2 separate states. People in these situations almost always use the same people. They trust the familiar infrastructure. It is, again, the confidence gap. Gerald also found, through a contact in Arizona, a woman named Dorothy. She was Thomas's daughter, the one who had contested the estate. She had been fighting the sealed settlement for 2 years. When Gerald called her, she said, "I was wondering when someone would finally call." She had recordings, too. Not the same kind as mine, but documentation, emails, text messages, a voicemail she had saved. She had been waiting for someone to build a case big enough to reopen the settlement. I called Dorothy myself, the week after everything came out. We spoke for almost 2 hours. She told me about her father, about how he had changed in the last year of his life, how he had become quieter, less himself, how he had pulled away from his children without explanation. She said she had always known something had been done to him, but she had never been able to prove it in a way that the court would accept. "You have enough now," I told her. "Gerald says we have enough." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I just wanted someone to believe me." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry it took this long. I have to tell you about Daniel." This is the part I sat with the longest, even longer than everything with Melissa, because it was the part where I had to figure out what was real. In the weeks after that day in my office, I went back through everything I had recorded and everything I had written down, and I looked at his words specifically, the things he had said to me, and I tried to understand how much he had known. Gerald had his own conclusions. The pattern of information that Melissa had been working from, the specific documents she'd targeted, the power of attorney draft, certain details of the investment accounts, those things had come from somewhere, and the most logical source was my son. But what I came to believe, after a lot of nights thinking about it, was that Daniel had not understood the full shape of what he was part of. He had been fed pieces. Melissa was very good at feeding people pieces, giving them just enough to feel informed while keeping the whole picture out of view. He had shared things with her because she was his wife and he trusted her, the way you trust someone when you love them, before you have any reason not to. He had not been a conspirator. He had been a source. There is a difference. I want to be honest that I'm not entirely sure. I may never be entirely sure. What I know is what happened when I sat down with him and told him everything. The notebook, the recordings, the attorney, Dorothy in Tucson, all of it. He didn't say anything for a long time. And then he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know yet how much you knew," I said. "And I needed to know the whole truth before I brought you into it." He looked like I had hit him, and then he looked like a man doing math in his head very fast, going back through conversations and moments, recalculating everything. I watched it happen on his face. It took a long time. He said, "The things she said about you, that you were getting confused, that you weren't managing things well." "I know," I said. "She said you were going to make bad decisions about the estate, that we needed to step in before you did something that hurt yourself." "I know. That's a very standard part of it. Isolate the target from people who might intervene by convincing them the target can't be trusted." He looked at the table. "She told me she was doing it out of love," he said quietly. "They always do," I said. We sat there for a long time. I poured us both more coffee because I needed something to do with my hands. The afternoon light came through the kitchen windows the way it does in October in Portland, that thin gold light that is already thinking about leaving. My son is not a bad person. He is a person who loved someone who turned out to be something other than what he thought she was. That happens. It happens to smart people, careful people, people who should have known better. Love is not a protection against being deceived by someone who is very skilled at deception. I have seen this in financial fraud. I have seen it in every other kind. The smartest people I ever caught had partners who loved them and never saw it coming. I told Daniel this. He didn't say anything. "I need you to understand something," I said. "What I did to protect myself and to protect you. You would have been implicated eventually. Whatever she was building, your name was attached to it. You were going to be either a victim or a suspect." I took that off the table. He looked up at me. "I know," he said. "I know." Gerald finished building the full case 3 weeks later. Melissa faced charges including unauthorized entry and theft of documents. The photos she had taken on her phone constituted removal of private legal documents under Oregon law. The Tucson case, with Dorothy's cooperation and the new evidence, was reopened by the Arizona Attorney General's office. That process will take time. These things always take time, but it is moving. My son filed for divorce. I did not tell him to. He made that decision himself. The same week he sat at my kitchen table and went back through every conversation and did the math. I think he had already known something was off before I told him anything. There are things you know in your body before you let your mind catch up. He just hadn't had the language for it yet. He came to stay with me for a few weeks while he figured out next steps. It was strange and good, having him back in the house. He cooked dinner twice, which he is not very good at, and I did not say so, and we watched old movies on Friday nights and I let him pick, because the things he picked were terrible, and it made me happy. I called Dorothy 2 months later to check in. The Tucson process had cleared its first major hurdle. She was cautiously optimistic. She said her brothers, who had also been estranged from her over the fight, had started talking to her again. "That's the part that got me the most," she said. "Not even the money, just that we stopped talking to each other. That's always the real damage," I said. "Everything else can be rebuilt, but the years you spend not talking to the people you love, those don't come back." She said, "How are you doing?" "Really?" I thought about it honestly before I answered, which I try to do when someone asks me something real. I thought about the 1.5 years since Robert died, the notebook, and the recorder, and the long nights when I wasn't sure if I was being a shrewd woman protecting herself or a paranoid old widow making up a villain because grief needed somewhere to go. I thought about standing in the doorway of my office with the policeman and Gerald, watching Melissa's expression change. I thought about my son at my kitchen table, doing the math, his face open and young and stunned. "I'm all right," I said. I trusted what I knew, and it turned out I was right to. "Do you feel safe now?" Dorothy asked. "Yes," I said. "My house is still mine. My son is still mine. And I know now I was paying attention when it mattered. That's not nothing, Vode." No, she said. That's not nothing at all. I still keep the notebook, not because I expect anything more, but because I am 63 years old and I have spent my whole professional life knowing that the details matter, that the small things you write down when they feel strange are the things that save you. Old habits. Good ones. My home office has a new lock on it. Better than the last one. Gerald picked it out. He said it would take someone with real tools and real time to get through it now. And I said, good. And he said, Helen, I don't think you're going to need it. And I said I knew, but that I kept it anyway. He understood. My son had dinner with me last Sunday. He brought wine, a decent one, and we sat at the table where Melissa had once laid out her neatly printed documents and talked about tax efficiency, and we ate pasta and talked about small things, his job, a podcast he'd been listening to, whether the oak tree in the backyard was going to need to come down eventually. Nothing important, everything important. I watched him, and I thought about the night Robert and I brought him home from the hospital in 1981, how I had been certain I was going to do everything wrong, and how Robert had put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're going to be fine. You're already paying attention." I was paying attention. I am still paying attention. And my house is still mine.